All right, it's time for us to get started. So, starting every class with important announcements. So we had lab yesterday. At this point, you basically have all of the tools that you need, I think, to start really planning for the associated sprint. So I made the assignment live this morning. So you should have access to all of the requirements. For the first sprint, I like to give you a lot of information. So there's a big text dump about all of the features, everything that you should be thinking about as you put together this first sprint. That said, there is certainly, I won't be doing that for every sprint. As we move further in this course, I'm going to start relying on kind of some verbal or not quite as technical descriptions that are quite as all-encompassing that will require you to think about what are the edge cases, what should this really be doing to be useful, relying on your knowledge of the programming languages that you are using and how your tool might be used. For the first sprint though, basically everything is there, everything that you should be thinking about, you will need to produce. So I think you can start to have conversations in your groups about who would like to do what. And today we're going to talk about how that needs to be documented and the actual planning process. What does that planning process look like? So after today's class, I'm hoping that we can start with writing user stories, converting those user stories into scenarios, and then creating tasks directly off of the scenarios. And that is the agile methodology for how to go from kind of client-based thinking, client-based communication to the actual technical requirements of what does our team need to produce for this sprint. Questions or concerns about that before we dive in? This is also the last class meeting of the week, so we don't meet tomorrow. You can expect a study guide for next Thursday's quiz. I will set aside at least some time next week. I don't know if that'll be during our lab period. It'll probably, at least for this one, be during the lab period. That we will be, I'll just have some time where I can answer some questions of yours about any of that material. So especially for our first quiz with a professor you might have had before, maybe you have some questions about how do I prepare for this? What should I be putting on the sheet of notes that I get to bring into this quiz? Because I will be writing this quiz so that it's not just referring to something that's on that sheet, but you'll want to look at that sheet to know what the thing is and then apply it to the best of your ability to answer questions. Yeah, but we'll talk about that next week. You can expect a study guide with the associated topics that will be on that quiz to be posted by the end of the day. If for some reason that doesn't happen, someone send me a very angry email. What else? Discussion for chapter 2 of debugging teams on Monday. I don't know if it'll be quite as in-depth as our first discussion, but we'll see how it goes. So that's kind of everything that is upcoming for now. I guess we can put the client meeting 2 weeks from yesterday. So we're down to 13 days left before Tony Espinosa waltzes in with no technical knowledge whatsoever and needs to be able to use the application that you will be developing for sprint 1. Last chance questions before we start a lovely 45 minutes of lecture. All right. Today is going to be really important because this is going to be the starting process for every sprint. This is what you're going to want to do to convert. In the future, Tony is going to give you the requirements for the sprint. And as the project manager, I will only really be talking to you about the technical requirements. So I will say it needs to be done in this way, but Tony will be verbally telling you what needs to be done. So you'll need to be taking notes on what are the requirements for the sprint. Let's actually talk about what a user story is. Now, it's a little bit outdated to think about exactly writing these on index cards, but you can start by coming up with a list of what are the user stories. A user story consists of a couple of components. We need first some title, some way to sort or recognize at a very quick glance, what is this user story? And the rest of it is some kind of customer-centered description or client-centered description on some requirement or need of what your application is going to do, something that needs to be accomplished in this sprint. This is no place for anything technical. You focus on what does this need to do, not why does it need to be done, or how are we going to accomplish it. So just the what. It will use client language because this is going to be part of our communication with a client that says, here, I have all of the stories that we're going to create for this. Does this look all encompassing? It becomes one of the ways that you can communicate with your client. You don't have to have all the stories in general in the first iteration of an iterative development. For the sake of this class, though, you'll want to have a good list of all of the user stories early on in the sprint for just the features that are required in that sprint. So we will actually have a due date for user stories for each of these sprints. That will be the first thing. You saw it on the rubric. You can see it on the rubric for sprint 1. There's 10 points dedicated to how all-encompassing and good, how well are they written for the user stories for the sprint. So this is something that is important for all of you to contribute to. Let's use an example that would get me in trouble. So my wife is an accountant. So whenever I show my own understanding of accounting and use it in a class, I get face balls. I get it. But that's not actually how this. So this is a bad example from an actual accounting perspective. I know this already. I've gotten in trouble for it. So a client approaches you and says, I need you to produce accounting software where I want to be able to create some kind of named account, an account that belongs to someone. I need to be able to list all of the accounts that have been created. For a particular account, I need to be able to query what is the balance of that account. And then finally, I need to be able to delete an account. Great, that is the quote that is given to you. And we might want to analyze this statement and figure out, okay, the client came to me with this. What are they actually asking me to do? What are the tasks that need to be done, the non-technical tasks? Let's give you an example. You can take a piece of this that says, I need to be able to create a named account. So we can write a user story about creating an account. The description of this is very non-technical, extremely non-technical. I can create a named account. Okay, well, what does that, well, we'll make these a little bit better as we go. So list accounts. We can start at the first iteration of this, it's just a description. I can get a list of all of the accounts in the system. We can now take the query the account balance part of the quote and say, all right, I should be able to query the account balance. The description for now just looks very similar to the title. And delete an account says, I can delete a named account. Does anyone see any issues with these user stories? Again, just focusing on the what, but yeah.
Everyone could do that for everything based on what you've described?
Yeah, the worst user stories are the vaguest. So there should be, if you can poke a hole or come up with multiple different ways to consider one of these, then it's a vague user story. You want your user stories to be as descriptive as possible without diving into the why or the how. We'll leave that to kind of the scenario and task part of this process. After we have the user stories, we're going to convert them into some technical requirements. But to start, for instance, there are some questions about, for instance, listing accounts. A list is an ordered list. If we're returning an ordered list, there are lots of different ways that the list could be ordered. So you can start to ask questions about how is the list ordered? This says that this user story is not descriptive enough. It's not technical. It's not telling you how to, like, what structure is used to return this. Is it an array? Is it a linked list? Your client doesn't care. Your client probably doesn't know what those things are. But what's important is if they're expecting that list to come back with a particular ordering, this is something that we should know, and it's a question that you should clarify by talking to the client so that you can actually expand this user story to contain the what about how is that list ordered. So be very careful of writing vague user stories. This is still just focusing on the what. An alphabetical list of all accounts, sorted alphabetically, now tells us that there is only one way to implement this in terms of the product that comes back from the listing of accounts. Without that description, if I ask random people here to implement that, they may return to me something that when I query each of their programs to list the accounts, the list may look very different. The idea is that there's only one way for this to be done correctly. In terms of, is it done or not from the client's perspective? So make sure that it's that straightforward. Where else are there vaguities in here? I'm making up words.
What does query mean about an account balance?
So it's discovering it or finding it, returning it.
Okay.
So yeah, the program needs to know, or the user needs to know, what is my account balance? I would query, ask the question, what is my account balance?
Oh, okay, gotcha. I was about to say, like, is that like too vague? Cause I don't know, I guess me, I just don't know what.
Yeah, I think the exact language of here is actually is okay, but there may be some other issues with this. Other ideas? Yeah,
I was thinking about creating an account, like what information we need to create an account.
yeah, what does an account contain? That's pretty important. Yeah, other ideas?
I just have a question. Why in
Yeah.
the descriptions do you say like I can delete, like it's like a motivational thing?
So, yeah, it's from the kind of the client's perspective. So the client should be able to do each of these things.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, client centered. So the client needs to be able to create an account. The client needs to be able to get the list of all accounts. The client needs to be able to determine how much money is in a particular account, especially if that account is yours. Or the client should be able to delete an account. Great question. Yeah,
This might be me being a bit pedantic, but I can delete a named account. Is there do I need to be specific about that?
potentially.
Like, I could delete a name account. Okay, I wanna delete everyone here but me.
That's what I was saying for my thing is, it doesn't specify who can do this, so I could delete anyone's account, I can check anyone's balance.
Sure. Sure, yeah, we don't really have a sense of the system in place yet, which is good. But imagine now that this is the CEO approach. So we're assuming from the CEO's perspective. So they should have kind of full read-write access to the system. There are still some issues that might come into play. What happens if you delete an account with money in it?
Oh, yeah, where's it go?
It's yours now.
Maybe it's just gone. We don't know something about that, so maybe we should be able to only delete an account if its balance is 0, move the money out of the account, then delete the account. So there are some logistical concerns that need to be considered as part of the user stories as well. So add some of that conditional logic into your user stories, because this is still a what. We're not specifying how this is done. But it is very important that we put some of the big problems that could occur in the user stories to make sure that when we refer to these user stories, we can start to create some technical requirements directly out of the user stories. We want there to be as little translation as possible between the user stories and making the next step that we're going to talk about. The next question I have for you is this a user story? The user interface will use Ajax technology to provide a cool and slick online experience.
It's not client-centered.
There's 2 problems. One, it's not client-centered at all. It's describing the how,
It's an advertisement.
and this is not concrete. a cool and slick online experience. What does that mean?
Buzzword.
Yes, that's useless. Yeah,
I was also gonna say, going back to what you just said in a few previous slides, it doesn't directly define the what, like, oh, cool, it gives a cool and slick online experience. How? What is it used for? Does it, like, if you click a button, does it have animation? Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot missing here, right?
Judging by maybe what we're supposed to do with the user, their stories, so the user stories are basically supposed to be parameters. This looks like an adjective of
Yes.
what the program, not an actual parameter definition of what it does.
So this is not a user story for multiple reasons. This is all good conversation. The idea behind this is that eventually, after you've gone through the development of this, these user stories become your acceptance tests. If you've done everything that you have a user story for, if you've implemented that using some technology, then you have the product that the client asked you for. So there can't be any branching points or vague statements in your user stories. Because if you do that and the client comes back to you and says, that's not what I wanted, there was an issue in the communication in your user stories. Either you weren't concrete enough, you didn't think to ask them to clarify what they mean by something. There are different ways to interpret those user stories. That's a lot of where that communication breaks down. When you don't ask enough questions to know exactly what they want. So you can put exactly what they want into a user story. That way, when you, the technology expert, go implement it, you come back and you say, I did this, that, and everything that there's a user story for. There should be no interpretation after that point. Good user stories lead directly to acceptance tests. So the concrete expressions of the user stories describe how the user stories will be tested, use concrete data examples associated with some existing user stories. So we'll come back to these user stories and figure out now, we want to find a better way to write these so that the description is a bit better. Was there a question? Yeah.
I was gonna ask if there was ever an instance of, like, when we'd have an importance on the why. So I figure like the how is pretty obvious on when, but
Yeah,
like, would we ever care to know why they want this type of program or anything like that, or application?
we're actually going to justify the why a little bit in how we are going to handle user stories. So this is not everything that you're going to need. There's a particular format that I want everybody to write their user stories in. And in fact, unfortunately on this slide, it's slightly reversed. I'm gonna have the third part be the second part and the second part be the third part, but the first part is the same. So here's an example of a title. And now we're gonna ditch the idea of a description and we're going to use the form as some stakeholder in the project. I want to do something so that what happens as a result of that? What functionality does it add from their perspective? So it's a little bit of the why, but it's a functionality focused why. So to add a movie to a, whatever this happens to be, as a movie fan, I want to add a movie to the Rotten Potatoes database so that I can share that movie with other fans. It puts you from the perspective of one of the stakeholders of the product that you are producing. You're producing this database and this interaction with this so that people who like movies can share the movies that they like with other movie fans. Sure, that makes sense. But now you understand why this needs to happen a little bit and who it affects. So this is how we want to define our user stories. So very short, everyday language. Usually it's either written by a customer or written with a customer right there with you. So this is the format that you're going to submit your user stories in. It's called the ConExtra format. And again, just flip this second and third one. as a stakeholder, I want to do some task so that some goal gets achieved. A goal from that stakeholder. I find that that has the most logical flow to it. The context or format doesn't specify the orders that this has to be in, then really, no new information is added, but I find that it flows the best in terms of natural language. Who, what, why? The idea behind this is it's already formulated as an acceptance test. If you implement this task somehow, if your eventual program has this functionality, again, this is not technically defined, but it's kind of the functionality that needs to be there from the perspective of the client, so that they can say yes or no. So, yeah. What do you want to consider with your user stories? And we have yet another acronym, just in case you weren't overloaded with enough acronyms in this field. But make sure that your user stories are specific. So they're not vague. There's only one way to test that you're doing what you need to do. They should be measurable, meaning that you have some way of determining whether you have achieved it or not. They should be achievable, meaning that you don't want it to be such a grandiose project that is the entire project that you're working on, or a very large chunk of that project. If you find that that's the case, usually what you actually have are multiple user stories hidden in a single user story. So if they're vague, break them into more. If it seems like this is going to take 3 months to get done, break it into steps. Make each one of those steps a user story. You want to be able to do it in a single iteration of the iterative waterfall that we talked about. In this class, that means a single sprint. So if you have some idea of what you eventually want to do with the project, but it's not in the scope of the exact sprint that we're working on, write the user story that's associated with this sprint, hold off on the user story for the cool feature that you're going to eventually implement later on. It should be relevant. So you should be able to answer who, what, when, where, and why. And it should also be time boxed. What that means is you give yourself an amount of time to accomplish it. If you say this should take 2 weeks of time to finish, to go from start to finish, 2 weeks elapse and you're not even close. You barely made progress. Maybe it just doesn't belong either in this sprint or even in this project. It may be time to go back to the client and say, is there some other way that we can accomplish whatever it is that you want? Because we dedicated 2 weeks to this, we're 2 weeks in and we barely made any progress. So we're gonna,
Again,
sorry,
what did you say was specific again?
it's just something that is not vague. There's only one way to do it.
Okay.
You know, it's phrased as an acceptance test. You will know when it is done and your client would agree with you that it is done. There's nothing that they can say that says you didn't do it right. In a little bit more detail, to be specific and measurable, every one of these should be testable. So we're going to start moving from user stories into scenarios. That is kind of the next part of this. And in fact, if I wanted to give you kind of a flow chart of this, you're going to go from user stories to scenarios to tests. Or tests, we'll call them tests. So the user stories is what you write in the client language with the client from a non-technical perspective. Scenarios, we're going to talk about here momentarily, but it mentions them here. So we're going to create kind of some more specific scenarios that might talk about exactly how the system works. Again, non-technical from the user's perspective. And then we break those down into tasks, and this is what goes in your GitHub issue board. you're gonna create these tasks and assign them to developers, or developers are gonna come pull tasks from the active task list and begin working on those. You're gonna assign yourself or assign someone else to particular tasks that need to be implemented. So this is how we go from the general to the technical and specific. So that example, UI should be user friendly. Again, what does that mean? This is probably a number of scenarios in themselves, but it's not specific and it's not measurable. How do we know we've accomplished user friendly? We should know from this what the definition is. The scenario part of this is going to be written using given, when, then terminology. So we have the user stories as a I want to, so that. That's a user story. A scenario is given, when, then. Given some specific starting conditions, so this lays out kind of the conditional of when does this scenario apply. Given that I am on this particular website page, when I take some action, when I click on this link, then I arrive on this landing page and see this. So it's very still user-centered. We don't have any technology associated with how are we going to accomplish this, but now we have ways of interacting with an application that hasn't been created yet. So these are your scenarios. Once you are done writing your user stories, you're going to start mapping those user stories into one or more scenarios. Once you have those scenarios, those should be one-to-one mappings with tasks, something that needs to be accomplished. So note how that language allows you and kind of guides you to being both specific and measurable. You know when you've succeeded, that's language built into this. If this, then this, then this. It's a very logical flow. So achievable just means we can do this in one iteration. We mentioned that already. So if you can't deliver the feature in a single iteration, deliver some subset of the user stories and something that will work by itself. You can critically think in the middle of a sprint, what are the tasks that need to be accomplished such that I have a working application at the end of this. You don't want there to be partially completed stuff that needs to be pushed to the next sprint. Focus on what can I create that is deliverable by this due date. There should never be fewer than one user story in a given iteration. That's the very lowest end of that. You'll find that for any of these sprints, there are going to be 15 to 30 user stories just within each sprint for this class. Relevance, you should think about the associated business value. What is this going to do for your client? For a particular user story, figure out why does this matter? Does it protect revenue? Does it increase revenue? Does it manage the cost? Does it increase the brand's value? Does it make the product better or more famous in some capacity? Does it provide value to the customers of the product? Think about the why behind it. If there's no real why behind your user story, kill it. It's not relevant. Finally, we talked about time boxed. We have a particular time budget for all of these features. If you exceed it, then put it on hold. Scrap it or move it to the next sprint if it's really important. So give up, divide it into smaller stories, accomplish some of those stories, but not all of them. Reschedule what is left to be done to future sprints, or reconsider including it as part of the project. And this helps prevent you from underestimating the length of the project. So we want to go from user stories to acceptance tests. Wouldn't it be great if we could just map the user stories directly into tests? How do we match the English text to testing code? How can we run these tests without some kind of human in the middle to be able to do this? So we're going to introduce one of the two different kinds of development, the idea of behavior-driven development. We build the actual tests. These are now unit tests or integration tests or acceptance tests. We'll define all of these in a lot more detail in a separate unit, but we want to write the tests directly from these user stories. The acceptance tests come from the fact that we expect that the customer will be happy with what we produce. And if we can go directly from the user stories that we write to what the client expects, then the customer should be satisfied. The integration tests mean that as multiple different people are developing pieces of the application at the same time, then when they're completed, what kinds of tests need to be written to ensure that the communication between those components is good, that it works as a whole. So we'll come back to integration tests and what those look like. Eventually, the idea is we want to meet halfway between the customer and the developer. We want both sides to be happy. User stories are code, so the customer can interface with those. We have a process now to convert user stories into technical requirements so that we can actually make progress developing based off of the communication we have with the client from the user story. We can connect these to real tests. We have a way to write the user stories. We have a way to write the scenarios. So we have some way to map these onto the eventual unit tests that we write for our code to ensure that what we're creating is technically sound. Here's an example. User story. We're going to go back to Rotten Potatoes, this Rotten Tomatoes spinoff. Story is, as a user, I want to add a new movie so that I can share my opinion. Great. Kind of a vague, little bit of a vague story, but it's something that just about anybody could say, yeah, that sounds right, regardless of their level of technical expertise. All right, we're going to take this client-centered language and we're going to create some kind of technical process out of it. How do we start? We start from their perspective. Given that I'm on the Rotten Potatoes homepage, when I click on or follow add a new movie, then I should be on the create new movie page. Another scenario, so this one user story has multiple scenarios associated with it. Still given, when I fill in the title that is on that create new movie page with Men in Black, and I select PG-13 from the rating dropdown, and I press save changes, then I should be back on the Rotten Potatoes homepage, and I should see Men in Black on that homepage. So this is kind of a usability, scenarios are very usability focused. How will the client be interacting with this? Again, nothing technical, but from this to this, and now you can imagine taking this and having a discussion with your team about how are we actually going to accomplish this? What technology should we use? What should the page layout look like? We can start to have those kinds of conversations to define the actual technical tasks that need to be done based off of a long list of scenarios that were built from your user stories. So user story, the scenario, the tasks. Questions on any of that? It seems like a very long, convoluted process, and trust me, it saves a lot of headache. A lot of headache when you're designing large-scale applications. So the user story is a single feature. We end up with one or more scenarios or features that kind of branch from that described feature in client language. And The idea is each scenario should be some number of steps, but try to cap it at about 8. You don't want this long flow diagram of all of the possibilities of how to handle something from a single scenario. Each scenario should be a bite-sized piece. Talk about this, talk about this. The scenarios directly become your acceptance criteria, basically. We can write tests directly from the scenarios. That leads to behavior-driven development. We develop our application based off of the behavior that we want it to have. Given the when, the then for the scenarios, you can use and or but to extend some previous step. So it doesn't just have to be step 1, step 2, step 3. We saw with that example, the when had an and, the then had an and associated with it. So you can use these articles, conjunctions. Questions on this idea? Yeah.
I just had a question for like, more like a realistic. So when you're going over this part and you're talking with your client, at what point or like what step do you talk about like the time requirements, like how long we have to go until this is done? Costs for like us on our end, like.
All of that is part of a much more legal conversation, like kind of the legal side of the contract that you're going to write. And usually from the programmer's perspective, you're not even involved in that. You're just gonna be given a list of features that need to be done, and you might need to go through this process and talk with the higher ups, the business focused people in the company on how do I divide up the time? What are my deliverable dates? Those are all conversations with different people within the company. If you have your own company, then you will be doing those kinds of legal discussions, but it's kind of outside of the scope of the actual development of the software. It's more of the business side of owning your own business. So we won't touch too much on that in this class, but I highly recommend if that's a route that you're interested in, take some associated business classes or even go get a business minor, and they will talk about a lot more. How do you ensure that we have the legal protections that you need for that? And then you'll map that to how long you think it's going to take, give yourself some leeway, etc. Everything takes at least twice as long as you think it will. Great questions though. Yeah.
So at any of these points, can we correct or suggest new things to customer? Like if the customer says, okay, I want this, so we can suggest, okay, we can give you some more options.
Yeah, if you do it this way, or this way, which one would you like? And then you have that conversation with them, and then you write the associated user story based on that conversation of what they want. But yeah, you can absolutely have back and forth with the client, have a discussion about what they want, and utilize your technological expertise to give them some options or optimizations on whatever it is that they're communicating with you. Some people will be really open to that. Some people will say, I don't care, just get it done. In which case, it's kind of up to you to figure out what they want. And of course, they're very angry when you don't read their mind correctly.
That's why you write down whatever I want.
That's why you want to go back to them once you have the scenarios and kind of go through and say, does this look like what you want? Do you have any feedback for me at this point? And remember that we go through this whole cycle of the waterfall every sprint. So we're going through this whole process. We're going to create kind of a skeleton program based off the very basic user stories. Then we're going to hand it to the client and say, play around with this. Do you have any suggestions? How usable is this? Do you have any suggestions? What would you add to this? Is there anything extraneous that you want us to remove? You scrap that prototype and you start building the application based off the feedback you get from the client about what they're actually looking for. So you don't have to talk completely in the abstract. You build them something, some bare bones. You get the feedback and they're actually using the bare bones systems you've created. All good stuff. So user stories are going to be due at some point early next week. In fact, let's say Monday. Monday night, we need to have user stories for that first sprint written. Note that the sprint one requirements are in the assignment in Canvas. So in the user stories channel, find some way to communicate that to Hunter and me. That could be a single long text file with all of the user stories written in it. You could decide that you want to brainstorm them together. So you can all just post the ones that you think of in a long list of those. And we'll go back to the history of when did this sprint start. The user stories posted since then are associated with this sprint. However you'd like to do it, we're just going to look at how thorough are those user stories and how clear are they? Do they adhere to the requirements? Are they clear? Yeah,
Where are we getting these stories from?
you're making them up. You're gonna, yes.
We need for the sprint.
Yep, you're gonna look at the sprint requirements and you're gonna say, all right, from the client perspective, what needs to be done? What are the features that our application needs to have in order to accomplish kind of the technical requirements that I have shown there? So I like to start that first sprint with that whole list. So the very first time you do this, you have that as a reference, so you can start mapping the requirements of what you need into client-centered language. But again, in the future, I won't be quite as specific with that. And you'll have to think critically about, given what Tony told us he wants, how do I create the user stories for that sprint?
And
Yeah.
that's gonna be one story from Tony to everybody, to all the teams.
Yes.
And everybody's gonna interpret based on their knowledge.
Yes,
Okay.
he will either have a script that I will write for him about that, or I will send him the features and I'll say, you figure out how you want to tell them this. But this is what it needs to have from the professor's perspective.
So what if it is identical to each other's?
Yeah, well, they'll look different. You'll have different design decisions with regards to what tools you're using to make it, just how it works. So he may have some particular frustrations later on in this course about that, and that'll be additional feedback that is specific to your team. The text is too small. I need to be able to zoom this, to be able to fit the size and scope of the project that I want to use this for, to be able to use your application. So that kind of feedback will be team specific. But yeah,
We'll submit them on our Discord.
Yeah.
The channel.
yeah, user stories will be in the user stories chat channel on Discord.
So it's gonna be one story per team or one story per individual in the team?
Neither. However many stories you need to map all of the features that are the requirements. My guess is there will be somewhere between 15 and 30. A lot of them. Make sure you're thorough with it and make sure that each one of them is specific. It's quite a bit of work, but it's the first step of the planning process for just kind of what needs to be done by the deadline. That's the first question you really need to be asking yourself when you're working on a team, because you don't want to have any lack of clarity when you start working. I think the project needs to include this. My partner, my other teammate thinks that the project needs to contain that. How do we figure out when we're done? We don't have a shared knowledge of a way to measure when we're done and when we're not. If you write a list of user stories and those user stories are complete, then if you convert those user stories to scenarios, convert those scenarios into tasks, and complete all of those tasks, then you will have an application that does what the client wants. You've converted from the non-technical to the technical and implemented everything. So there's enough in that first sprint that there will be a significant number of user stories. And that grade will be team-wide. Everyone gets the same grade for just the user stories part of this, what's there and what's not. If you find that you have a member who is not contributing very much, this is when Tuesday nights, starting next week, we're going to be submitting peer reviews. So this is your opportunity to say, my teammates aren't doing as much work as I am. They're not contributing to the discussion. They're not helping me take my ideas and converting them into this language. So that's where you can air frustrations about non-equal work across your team. So it is expected that all of you are involved. It's expected that you aren't taking over the project. You're giving room for everyone to contribute and for everyone to learn from the process. So keep that in mind and keep asking each other as well. Do you feel included? Do you feel like you're contributing as much as you can? Have those kinds of conversations with each other just to make sure that you're opening the dialogue for those kinds of frustrations to air themselves and for you to have something you can do about that ahead of those peer reviews. Please don't stay silent. Obviously, if there are large-scale issues within the peer reviews, I will take a look at those. I'll pull aside the associated members and have conversations and make whatever grade changes that I need to based on the dynamic of the team. So I will moderate the whole thing to make sure it's as fair as possible to everybody involved. All right, just a few minutes, we can start to tackle the next one. Did I prepare the next one? No, I did not. Oh. We are going to start talking about the Agile process. So Agile software development was published, the manifesto published in 2001, and it's been the supermajority type of development since then. It's that good. So everything we've talked about is relevant. We're going to be going through the iterative process, iterative waterfall process, kind of extreme programming. You're going to have sprints that are in general 1 to 4 weeks long. In this class, it will be 2 weeks per sprint usually. And this helps us to be able to merge the project and shift it as technology changes, as requirements change, as we get more information from the client. Basically, we have an adaptable model as we move forward in the project. So the structure of the team, the idea is that each member has some subset of roles. We have developers, we have testers that are distinct from developers. We have product owners. We have the Scrum Master who's responsible for all of the communication between this. Unfortunately, I want everybody to kind of play all of these roles at different points throughout the quarter. So don't go assigning yourselves to permanent roles, but kind of mold yourself to be different roles depending on the team's needs and your strengths throughout the quarter. So the product owner is the kind of business owner, the person who thinks about everything from the business perspective. So we need to define the requirements, the business requirements, prioritize to make sure that the project that's being developed has business value. They're also going to determine the release date, what needs to be in each subsequent release. Any iteration meeting, planning meeting that's necessary to figure out what needs to be done, and then accepts or rejects the work that is done by the developers, the testers throughout each iteration. So this is mostly me. I'm the one who's defining the requirements for each of the sprints. I'm telling you when it's due. I'm telling you kind of how to plan the process, how to communicate, and I will assign a grade associated with the work that you contribute at the end of each iteration. So this is kind of the me role in this class. The Scrum Master is going to make sure that the team is as productive as possible. So trying to find, hey, you're working on this, you're working on this, you could actually work together, and I think you'd be more effective. So keeping in mind the large scale part of the project. Someone says, I'm really struggling with using this particular technology and integrating it into the product. This person may do a little bit of research and say, you should reach out to this other person, or have you looked at this particular resource for it? Or this other member of your team had this same issue last week. Talk to them. So works with upper management to track the progress of the application's development. The last thing that I really want to talk about, this is going to start being a requirement, I think, on Monday, is that you will see that your Discords also have a Scrum channel. Normally, these are meetings that are held either in person or remote. They last about 15 minutes, very short. The idea is to answer 3 questions. So starting Monday and continuing the entire quarter for every day this class meets. So only Monday through Thursday will it be graded, but I recommend doing this every day because I assume that a lot of you are going to get a lot of work done over the weekends. So whenever you get something done, you will want to post a scrum to the scrum channel. We'll be looking for it between midnight and 11:59 p.m. on every day the class meets at a minimum. You'll post 3 things. You'll post, what have I accomplished since the last meeting that we did? So between the last update that you got from me and right now, what is accomplished? The second piece, what am I working on today? Or what are my current tasks? What am I doing? And the third piece of information is, what is preventing me from making progress, if anything? So what am I blocked by? And this knowledge is very useful to other members of your team because they may be able to help you with this. They may have ideas. They may have experience that you weren't aware of. Just the fact that you let that out there and said, this is what's preventing me from getting the work done. It does not say I could not get this work done, but it says, this is what's currently preventing me from making progress. So it's not an admission of failure. It's not an admission that I can't do this. It's just saying, here's what I'm currently struggling with. And that way, if someone can be useful to you, they will reach out to you. Or you can reach out to reaching out to your team. So those 3 things in the Scrum channel, somewhere between midnight and 11:59 every day the class meets. Preferably every day we get something done, but that minimum. All right. We'll call that for the week. We'll meet on Monday. Back in here and we will talk about exactly what the UML diagrams look like in general. Don't